Okay, good evening everyone. Who has been here every week so far, the last 3 weeks? Raise your hand. Okay, good. For the rest of you, where were you? Okay, so in the last few weeks I've been talking about mindfulness. This particular quality that is one aspect of the mind that is there and is present in every state if we turn attention to it. So mindfulness is there if we ask the question, is mindfulness there? Or am I conscious? This particular quality is something that is overlooked by most people. And it doesn't seem like very much. If we talk about the goal of supreme, perfect, total spiritual enlightenment, going completely beyond any kind of suffering, going completely beyond birth and death, this grand goal that we can have. What would be the tools that would take us to that grand goal? And we have mindfulness. You just know what you're doing. Doesn't sound like very much, does it? Normally you might think, well, it must be absolute renunciation. Or one story I'm quite fond of was a family in England during the time of King John, which is Robin Hood kind of era. And he was from extraordinarily rich family. And he wanted to go to stay in the church in France. And to do that, he thought he would go barefoot. Now, if you've ever walked barefoot in England, you know this is not a pleasant place to walk barefoot. In Australia it's okay, but not in England. And also he decided to only wear a horsehair shirt. And horsehair is said to be hot and sticky in the summer and freezing cold in the winter. So the horsehair shirt was great renunciation. And his mother was so proud of him that she gave him an iron belt to wear around his horsehair shirt. Now that kind of renunciation, is that going to take you to perfect, total, and complete and utter spiritual liberation? What we do have is this one quality of wakefulness. And it doesn't seem like very much. And one element that we find in fairy tales is that the protagonist, the hero or the heroine, always has some kind of special tool or special quality. And it's that quality that will enable them to succeed in the impossible task. So, Snow White, what did she have? The Wicked Witch had magic and power, and Snow White had a pretty face. Doesn't sound like very much that's going to enable her to win the victory. Jack and the Beanstalk, he took the family cow and he traded it in for 5 magic beans. And his mother was disgusted and clipped him around the ear. Luke Skywalker, he had a lightsaber. How is that going to defeat the Galactic Empire? George Lucas, when he wrote Star Wars, based it on an outline provided to him by Joseph Campbell, who was one of the world's great mythologists. And so it's by no accident that Star Wars follows this particular format. So, all of these fairy tales, one of the common elements and elements in fairy tales we call motifs, is that the heroine or the hero will have a tool or an ability or something that seems in the worldly eyes to be without value. And this, in our story tonight, is the queen bee. And you'll see here, once again, the same motif appears. Now, I might mention the fairy tales, where do they come from? Each culture around the world has had a storytelling tradition. Stories are the ways in which human beings relate to the world. The world is too complicated to understand any other way. And we have an insatiable appetite for stories. Look at the stories pumped out in movies every year, in books every year. Our appetite for stories never stops. But there are certain forms of storytelling. One way to look at it is that myths are about great gods and forces of the universe. Legends are about great men, or women, of course, and their deeds, which are above humans, but not quite at the level of God. And then fairy tales are relating to more human or more regular people. That's one way to look at it. The fairy tales that came to Europe, quite possibly, and I'm on shaky ground, so when we have questions at the end, then this is not the one to ask questions on. But it's quite likely that the fairy tales that we have actually come from the Aryan tradition. And there's a lot of debate about Aryans. Who were they? Where did they come from? One of the common viewpoints seems to be that the Aryan people started on the steppes of Russia and spread down into North India, and spread down into Greece and Rome. They spread to the Norway and the Celts in Europe. They took with them a particular form of storytelling. This form of storytelling, when it mixed with the Proto-Europeans, became Greek and Roman mythology. When it mixed with the Nordic peoples, it became Norwegian mythology. And when it got to England and the Celts were from Celts or Celts, I never figured out which it is. It's who were in England, Ireland, and northern France. It took on another kind of flavour, but these traditions are very closely related. Now, the Aryans were originally nomadic people, so they didn't have a tradition of writing, or they didn't live in cities with a strong tradition. They lived in nomadic communities and they moved a lot. So the way that they transmitted their wisdom was through the story. And I think I mentioned in the first week there are several ways in which information or wisdom can be transmitted. One is chanting or recitation, which is how Buddhism was transmitted. Another is through writing or record keeping by pictures and art. And the third one is through storytelling. Now, it seems that the Aryan people also had this idea of enlightenment of some kind. And this quite possibly, you notice all these might be, possibly, could be, kind of, sort of, kind of, maybe, kind of language, because it's very vague. This could well be where the Buddha got the idea of enlightenment from, too. Because it's not obvious that there is this enlightenment, nirvana, this ultimate attainment of human beings that we can attain to. So it's quite possible that the Aryan tradition had gone down into northern India and had become there the Brahminic tradition, and it's the Brahmin tradition that had kept alive this idea of the amata. And amata, the word amata means something that doesn't die. Mata means death, amata means deathless. It doesn't mean that you attain to immortality. It means that there is something that is immortal, or like you might think of it like an essence somewhere in the being, and that you can attain to this amata. The qualities of the amata are it doesn't arise, it doesn't change, and it doesn't cease. But the qualities of the person who has attained to it means that they get endless happiness without cost. Now, if there's any other kind of happiness that you can attain to, there is some cost to that happiness. How do you get your happiness? You have a pet cat. Do you have cats in Australia? I've seen very few cats in Australia. Cataclysm. I've been to the dog park on the light railway station and the dog park, and millions of people there with their dogs. I think they go to meet the other dog owners. Whatever method it is that you use to get your happiness, there's some kind of cost to that. Cats, there's certainly a cost because they can worry you, or you need to feed them, and you need to take them to the vets, and it can be expensive, right? Other kinds of happiness will make you fat, make you put on weight. They will cost you money. They will get you into trouble. People climb up mountains for what? The happiness of climbing up mountains, but it's hard work. So whatever this spiritual enlightenment is, it provides happiness without cost. And we also find this in the Bible, in the Old Testament, which, if you're interested, I can mention the reference later. This element had come through into the stories that had come possibly with the Aryan people into Northern Europe, and especially also in Russia. And so this idea was encapsulated, was still maintained within the fairy tale tradition. Not all fairy tales are about enlightenment, many aren't, but many of them are. So I want to mention that because it's quite likely that this idea of this ultimate goal is actually coming from the same source as the Buddha's own inspiration to go and practice the holy life. Fairy tales then, European fairy tales have a particular form, and the form is usually quite bizarre, right? Quite difficult to understand. And so many people these days are abandoning traditional fairy tales and having little morality tales instead. Our good friend Madonna was so disgusted with fairy tales that she wrote her own stories instead about little railway engines and cats and things. And they were nice, cute little stories meant to teach their children something, but completely failed to really understand how fairy tales work. And the fairy tales are speaking directly to the unconscious mind. And where the conscious mind does not understand something, the unconscious mind understands it clearly. Now children, their unconscious mind or their subconscious understanding is much more accessible because they haven't covered it up yet with logic and logical thinking and views and opinion. So they're more able to understand the motifs within the stories. Plus, many of the things that happen in fairy tales relate directly to children and maybe things that we've kind of forgotten about. So, for example, witches. Did I tell you about witches the other week? No? Have you all seen Harry Potter? Yes. Has anybody not seen Harry Potter? Okay, good. I wouldn't go and see Harry Potter myself. So, as all of you know, except for those three real good renunciates here, in Harry Potter they fly around on their broomsticks and they play this air hockey thing, right?
Quidditch.
What's it called?
Quidditch.
Quidditch. Quidditch. Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't admit to knowing that kind of thing. Just a tip for you. And so where does this idea come from? Why are they zooming around in the air on broomsticks? This is what they do on the film. So, if you think of a child, when a child is young and is a baby, they really don't know much of the universe around them. And the thing that they know is they're hungry and they want to poop. That's pretty much it. Food in, food out, sleep. Is there anything else that babies do?
Cry.
Yeah, but they're crying because they want food or they want to poop or they have some kind of suffering going on. That's why they're crying. And crying work is a very successful system that babies have worked out of how to control the parents. Right? Because they, oh, shut up. And then they get their food. So they've learned how to control the parents. And it works wonderfully well for the children. But then when the child gets to about 6 years old, 5 years old, suddenly the rules change. And to a child, this is extremely traumatic. They were living in a universe that they'd worked out and understood. Scream, get fed. Want to poop? You just do it. Right? I had a friend of mine, I have to confess, I don't like children very much. And the feeling is mutual. They really don't like me very much either. And I was at my friend's house in Chiang Mai, and he was bouncing his son on his lap, and his son was like this, and going on, and he's just talking to me like a regular person, and I'm like, after 10 minutes of this, I'm like, can't you switch him off? I couldn't take it anymore. And this is what my friend said to me. He said, oh, it's all right, he just wants to fart. I'm like, so do I, but I don't scream and scream and scream like this. What? He said, no, that's it. And true enough, he's bouncing the baby, and then and the baby went. Settled down to sleep. Really, I was totally amazed at this. Now, I've studied psychology, and Freud was saying that small things to babies are extremely important, whereas to us, we wouldn't notice them. And I have other examples of this, if you would like to know. Jot it down and ask a question at the end. So, the baby lives in this universe, and as it's trying to understand the world around it, this is a quite simple universe. You scream, you get your food. You want to poop, you poop. And it's a pretty simple universe. But suddenly the parents will change the rules. And the parents will say, okay, now you're getting bigger. You will eat not when you scream and cry, but you will eat when I give you the poop. And you will poop not only when you want to poop, but you will do it in the right place and at the right time. And if you want my attention, you can't have my attention whenever you want it. You're going to get my attention when I decide to give you attention. And this is what Freud identified correctly. Freud was not a terribly nice person. He wasn't enlightened, that's for sure. Cocaine addicted. He's kind of like a creepy uncle, you know, those that you didn't want to... You know, yours like groaned when your parents were taking you to somebody's house. He was that kind of person. But he was a very, very good observer. And so he said that to a child this is traumatic when the rules change. And now the child doesn't get what it wants, it gets what the parents decide to give it. You poop in the right place, you eat at the right time, you go off and play by yourself, and you get my attention when I decide to give it to you. And they have to suddenly learn there are rules to existence. And this, incidentally, is what Freud said was the development of the ego. And the ego is a good thing, both in Freudian psychology and in Buddhism. And it's something that is supposed to be developed. The ego knows that you should get what's good for you, not what you want. So the baby gets what it wants. That's the id. I want this, and I want to get it. But the ego learns that there are certain things that are good for you and not good for you. You might want to poop, but you can't. You've got to wait and go to the toilet. So toilet training was a big deal in Freudian psychology because it's a big deal to the child. So, this child who's just starting to learn that there are rules to existence. And by the way, have you seen this in the Marshmallow Test? Have you all seen the Marshmallow Test? Go to YouTube, look up Marshmallow Test. And this is a famous experiment done to show this particular aspect of children. And what they did, they wanted to see, is there really an id and an ego? Id is pleasure principle, desire. Ego is working by the rules and regulations that your parents set. And Freud said these two parts of your mind are at war with each other. And they create a stress and a tension that will last with you throughout your life. Interesting. Can we prove it? Yes. Marshmallows.
Oh, you shouldn't be making them sound sorry. I've turned off the phone. Why is it doing this? Sorry. The phone's turned off.
It's crying out for attention.
Take the battery up. I assure you, it won't go to the battery.
So in the Marshmallow Test, they place a child in a blank room with a table and a chair and a video camera, some usually hidden, and they give the child one marshmallow. A marshmallow is just a soft candy, in case you don't know. And they say to the child, right, if you want, you can eat that marshmallow. But if you wait until I come back, I will give you 2 marshmallows. And then the parent leaves the room, and the camera is left on this child. Nothing at all in the entire room, just one marshmallow on a table, like this. So what do you think happened?
Waiting on.
Okay, you just failed the marshmallow test. So some kids are like, one of them is very funny, this little girl, her mother leaves, and she goes straight in the mouth, half a second. And then about a minute later, she just held it in her mouth but didn't want to swallow it and eat it. Another kid is stuffing it in his ear, and someone else is hollowing bits out from inside, and it looks like it's a whole marshmallow. And some of them like squashing it like this, and some of them like push to the side like this. And this is the id and the ego battling. The id wants to eat the marshmallow. The ego says, no, it's better to wait. Follow the rules. Tests done with this marshmallow test. Your success at not eating the one marshmallow will determine, or very closely correlated to your chances of being in prison in later life. People who fail the marshmallow test are more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to fail exams. The children, even as young as 4 or 5 years old, who can wait for the longest and the happiest, are more likely to pass their exams, more likely to get a good job, and interestingly, more likely to have a stable marriage. So some of you young people, if you're about to get married and you're choosing your husband or your wife, get the marshmallows out. So this has been well documented, and look it up on YouTube. It's quite funny. So a child, he's learning that there is now a difference to the rules by which it has to live, and it needs to learn the new rules. So witches, where did witches come from? Well, in every story where there's a witch, there's also a fairy godmother. And to a child, the child sees that they have two mothers. They have the mother who's a beautiful angel and feeds it everything it wants and looks after it and is kindly. And there is also the mother who's like, go away, get out, you're under my feet, go and do something, I'm not feeding you, I'm not helping you. And that would usually be when the mum is wandering around the house cleaning up, right? She's literally flying around on a broomstick. And the child learns that when that lady is flying around on a broomstick, that's not the fairy godmother, that's the evil witch who isn't going to give me attention, isn't going to give me food, and I better stay out of the way. So the child sees these two mothers. Now, if you think that's a little gender specific, remember fairy tales are coming up, over the last 1,000 years, so it was probably quite accurate. So that's just an example that to us, we see an evil woman flying in the air on a broomstick. Why would you introduce that to a child? It doesn't make any sense. But to a child, they understand that perfectly. Not with the conscious mind, but the unconscious mind can immediately relate to these two different mothers. Okay? So, it's just an example that the motifs and the elements in these stories may seem very bizarre and very strange, but actually they're speaking to an unconscious that the child would not be able to express, but would nonetheless understand. Then we come to the question, should we explain the fairy tales? Should we not just leave it for the unconscious mind? I think probably so with children, but with adults, because the fairy tales just are a little bizarre, we really benefit from understanding the meaning behind it. So, I'm going to give you one fairy tale this evening. It's a rather obscure fairy tale called The Queen Bee. This one I particularly like because it's not too long. So many of the stories that I have are very long. And I'll do a rendition of the story, and the idea is that you just let the unconscious try to understand it. Don't try to work it out with the conscious mind. Let the unconscious see how you feel about things. If there are moments in the story that grab your attention and make you feel something, then you make a note of that. Are you ready? There are two brothers, and they come to the point where it's time to leave home. And they leave home and they go out to seek their fortune in the world. And both of them, they had some money given to them by their father, but they wasted it. And because of their wasteful lifestyle, they quite soon hit upon hard times. Now these two tall, handsome brothers had a third brother, but he was neither tall nor handsome. He was an insignificant dwarf. And the insignificant dwarf decided that he also should leave the home and go out and seek his fortune. So he goes out, and before long he comes across his two brothers who are living in a destitute situation. And he says to his brothers, I've come out to seek my fortune just like you have. And they laugh at him. You're just an insignificant dwarf. How do you think you can succeed where both of us have failed? he says, nonetheless, let the three of us continue on our journey. So the three of them continue along. Before very long, they come upon two ducks. And, the first one. Before very long, they come upon an anthill. And the two brothers see this anthill and they think, yeah, great, let's kick the anthill over and watch all these scared little ants running about hither and thither in fear. And they're about to kick over that anthill. And the insignificant dwarf says to them, stop, I will not suffer you to disturb these poor ants. Leave them be. So they walk on a little further. And before very long, they come across some ducks. And the brothers think, great, food. And they start setting up their bows and arrows and their nets to go and catch the ducks. And the insignificant dwarf said, stop, I will not suffer you to harm these ducks. So they did not eat duck that evening. And they walk on some time further. And at some point further along the path, they come across a bee's hive. Beehive, bee's hive. Is it singular or beehive? Bee's hive. Beehive. And the brothers think, fabulous, we will light a fire underneath the beehive. Now the reason they would do this is to get at the honey in the beehive, you have to smoke out the bees by lighting a big smoky fire under the beehive. Then you can get into the honey. And as they're about to light this fire, the young insignificant dwarf says to them, stop, I will not suffer you to disturb these bees. Leave them alone. So they carry on further. And at some point they come across a kingdom, small kingdom. And they head towards the palace in the center of the kingdom. And they walk past the stables. And in the stables are these really beautiful, fine, mighty, strong horses. But the horses have been turned to stone. They enter into the palace or the castle, and they eventually come to a door and they peer through the door, and there's this very old man inside. And they call out to him a few times, but he doesn't answer. But the third time that they call out, he comes over and he opens the door. He takes them inside the room, and inside the room he feeds them fine food. After feeding them fine food, he takes them to the bedchambers, and they get a really nice night's sleep. The next day they wake up and come back out, and the old man presents them with some tablets, and on these tablets is inscribed some instructions. And the instructions say that to free the kingdom from this curse where everything is turned to stone, they have to complete 3 tasks. And the first task is to go out into the forest where the king's daughter's pearls have been scattered. And there's 1,000 of these pearls scattered throughout the forest. So the first son is charged with this task to go and find all the pearls. If he fails to find all of the pearls by sundown, he gets turned to stone. So out he goes, running around, he finds 2, 3, 4 pearls, sundown, turned to stone. So the second son, on the next morning, he also is charged with the same task, presented with this tablet with the instructions on it. So he too goes out into the forest. He can only find a couple of these pearls, and then he's turned to stone. The insignificant dwarf, on the next day, he is sent out to find all the pearls. But he doesn't even try. He looks around this mighty forest, he looks at the moss which covers up all of these pearls. How can I ever possibly do this task? And so he sits down on a rock and he starts to cry. And while he's crying, he gets visited. You know who visits him? The king of the ants. And he explains to the king of the ants why he's sitting there crying. And the ant says, but this is no problem for us. There are thousands of us ants. It will take us no time to find all these pearls. And they go and they gather up these 1,000 pearls and put them in a heap. So by sundown, the insignificant dwarf is not turned to stone. However, there are still 2 more tasks for him to complete. So the next day, he's given the tablet for the next instruction. He's told that the key to the princess's bedchamber, which has to be worth finding, right, has been dropped in the lake. And his task is to find the key to the princess's bedchamber. So he goes out and he looks across this lake, and it's just this enormous lake, and deep too. How can he possibly find this key? He sits down on a rock and he starts to cry. And at that moment he's visited by the duck, king of the duck. And the duck says, but diving in water is no problem for us ducks. You just sit there and rest. And before very long, the duck had gone and found the key. So he's not turned into stone a second time. Now the third and final task that he's given. After opening the bedchamber of the princess, what he found was there were 3 princesses turned to stone. And before they were turned to stone, one of those princesses had been eating sugar. And one of those princesses had been eating syrup. But the youngest and most beautiful of those princesses had been eating honey. And he has to tell which one is the youngest and most beautiful one that had been eating honey. But when he looked at these stone princesses, he cannot tell any difference between the 3 of them at all. So, how is he going to resolve this task?
Hit the bees.
So the queen bee comes along at that moment and says to him, don't worry, this is an easy job for me. And so the queen bee goes and lands on the lips of the one princess, then goes and lands on the lips of the second princess, and then finally goes to the third princess and lands on her lips and stays there. So the insignificant dwarf says, that's the youngest and most beautiful of the princesses who had been eating honey. At that moment, the princesses return to life, the horses return to life, his brothers return to life, the whole kingdom blooms, and the insignificant dwarf, he got to marry the youngest and most beautiful princess, and his 2 brothers got to marry the other 2 princesses. So, after that, they all lived happily ever after, except the 2 brothers were divorced later on, and then they put on a bit of weight, and so.
Talk about good karma and being kind to other animals.
Good karma and being kind to animals. True enough. Is there any part of the story that jumps out at you?
Always cry.
Huh?
Just what you want. They always cry.
You always cry.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Compassion, and it got rewarded.
Compassion. But that's the logical mind, you see. Got to listen to it from the unconscious.
could it be that actions are more important than appearance?
Actions are more important than appearance. Well, I'll give you the breakdown of how it works. First of all, there are two older brothers and the insignificant dwarf. Why the insignificant dwarf? Because when you tell a story to children, children are always overawed by their older brothers. They're always overawed by their parents. And every child feels like this little tiny creature down here looking up at this adult world. So to a child it's traumatic being an insignificant dwarf. They can't understand how they will ever be able to live in an adult world. So the story is always going to be about the insignificant dwarf. And if the child has had any kind of upbringing around fairy tales, they will know instantly that insignificant dwarf is the one that will save the day. Right? They will just know that instantly. Because that's how they feel. So they know now the story is about them, even if they don't know it through the conscious mind. Why two older brothers? Well, whenever you try to do something, it's always going to take several attempts. And to do anything that's worthwhile, usually you will have to make several attempts to do it. So, again, this motif of making 3 attempts at something is a motif that tells children it's okay to fail, it's okay not to be as good as you think you're going to be, but in the end it will work out. Often there's 3 attempts, sometimes there's 6, sometimes there's 12. So you might remember the 12 tasks of Hercules, for example, Heracles, depending if you're Greek or Roman. So the next thing, the 2 brothers go out and the insignificant dwarf follows along later, and he meets up with them. Now they've been wasting their inheritance that they got from the father. Notice the dwarf never got any money from his father. They've been wasting their money, wasting their time. And again, this is a motif that tells children to be careful with what they do and not to waste their time, not to waste their resources. But now we get to the really interesting bit. Why an anthill? What does an anthill signify?
Industry.
Industry.
Cooperation.
Industry, cooperation. Interestingly, in Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, the 7 dwarfs actually represent industry. And the dwarfs that live in the mine are the ones that do the work in the background of the consciousness. They just do the job that they're supposed to do. So dwarves usually represent industry. The ants represent thoughts and thinking for several reasons. Firstly, there are millions and millions of ants. How else can you represent these millions and millions and millions of thoughts? So, millions and millions of ants. Now, ants will organize themselves and walk in lines, right? And often if they've got food here, they'll walk along the line and then come and get the food instead of going directly, right? They organize themselves into nice, neat lines to get on with their work. And this is thinking when you are behaving in the right way and you're looking after your thoughts. But if you don't look after your thoughts and your thinking, it's like kicking over the anthill. And what happens is, your mind, it scurries here, it scurries there, it runs around in utter confusion and madness. So the 2 brothers, they don't understand about looking after their thoughts, being mindful of their thinking. So they're quite happy just to kick it over, and they think it's fun when the mind runs here and the mind runs there and it's not organized and not systematic. So the next thing that the trio meet are the ducks. And the ducks represent desire. This is why the 2 brothers, they wanted to eat the ducks. It's a pretty straightforward representation of pure desire. So again here we've got the motif. You need to be careful with your desires, careful with your thinking, but you need to be careful with your desires also. Another thing with ducks is they go underwater, so they're representing this thing that comes up from the unconscious, because we don't know where desires come from. So they come up from under the water. Water always represents the unconscious. In the Bible, in the Buddhist stories, in fairy tales. Buddha talked about the Dharma as being a raft that takes you over the sea of sense desires, and he stated this explicitly. So, the next thing that they come to are the bees. And bees have a very special significance in fairy tales. Bees are especially holy animals. And in most cultures around the world, actually, if you do something and there are bees around, that's very, very auspicious. Yeah. I had a friend of mine who got married and a big swarm of bees came. And he thought it was terrible, but I'm like, no, this is really auspicious. This, like, when bees come and join in, this is really good. He's now divorced, but... So why are bees so spiritually significant? A bee will deliver you with two things: a drop of honey or a sting. So bees represent your spiritual aspirations. And a spiritual aspiration, if you live up to it, will give you a drop of honey, will make you a bit sweeter and a bit happier. But if you have a spiritual aspiration and you don't live up to it, you get a sting, like a prick in your conscience, I should say. So bees have this twin faculty. They represent spiritual aspirations. So these three things: look after your thinking, look after your desires, and live up to your spiritual aspirations, is the message that comes through the story. Then, of course, the ants will help him to find the pearls. What are pearls? Quite literally, pearls of wisdom. Why are the pearls of wisdom in the forest? The forest always represents the world. And going out into the forest is always dark, dangerous, and uncomfortable. Remember that for all cultures around the world, the forest is not a pleasant thing. Now we think of like these lovely trees, and they give us oxygen, and they have these cuddly tigers and things, but forests were nasty, awful, dark places that you did not want to go into. In fact, there's even in psychology, there's some tests that you can do on people to elicit from them what they really think about things, not what they say they think about things. And one of these tests is you say to the client, you say, imagine yourself going into a forest, describe the forest. And some of them see little Tweety birds and occasional trees and rivers. And some of them see like big, hard, nasty trees that are very closely packed and dense. And we can use their understanding of the forest to see how they view life. Do they view life as something dangerous, tightly packed, unable to move? Or do they see a wide open forest with open spaces and ponds and lakes and birds? So these symbols go very, very deep. So within the forest, which represents life, hidden in the forest are the pearls of wisdom. And if you've looked after your thoughts, you can find the pearls of wisdom. The water, as I said, represents sense desires. Water nearly always represents sense desires in all traditions. However, water has different forms. So a sea is always the nastiest form. A big lake is an unpleasant form. But when you get down to a small pond that will give you clean drinking water, then that usually is representing the purified mind. So here we have a big lake, not a pretty little pond. And to dive down into the lake gets the key. Now the key always represents yourself. In this story, the motif isn't so clear, but I'm telling you so that when you see and hear other stories, a key always represents how you feel about yourself. And finding a key literally means finding yourself. In this story, the key is representing the controlling of the desires, because it's the key to yourself that you find within the sea of sense desires. Look after your desires. And then finally they come to the bees, which I've just explained. When they come to the kingdom, notice the first thing, what did they come across? The stables. You have to notice all these little things. And these big, grand, fine horses that were turned to stone. Now, horses also represent thinking. And thinking in the element of conscious attention. And again, this goes across all cultures. Tibetans had this idea that you have the 84,000 pathways through the body, consciousness pathways, and the thing that takes your consciousness through these pathways are the two horses of consciousness and attention. And these two horses will pull you in these different directions. In Journey to the West, the classic tale, Chinese tale, monkey, when he goes up to heaven, what is the job that he is given when he gets to heaven? The keeper of the horses. But monkey didn't look after the horses properly, and that's why heaven turned into chaos in that story. So, horses represent thinking, and they're turned to stone because at this point, if you haven't done the right things, you're now in a kingdom where nothing works. And again, to a child, this is quite a telling motif, because they're often put in situations where they just don't understand what's going on, they don't understand what to do, and they quite literally turn to stone. They don't know what to think or how to act, and they stop. And this is the motif of a kingdom that's turned to stone. So as they go inside the castle, again the castle represents the self, so you're going inside. A common element of stories, the first time you attain to the magic kingdom, Parsifal attained to the Holy Grail kingdom, Jack and the Beanstalk attained to the Cloud kingdom. Here they get into the castle. The first time into a kingdom, very often the person is given food or has a happy experience. But every experience after that initial experience will be unpleasant. So Jack, for example, he goes into the ogre's kingdom. You know Jack and the Beanstalk, right? He goes into the ogre's kingdom, and the ogre's wife feeds him with food, and when the ogre is approaching, she hides him in the oven. But ever after that, you never see the ogre's wife again, you only see the ogre. This means that as you take the mind inside, the inward journey, first of all, you start to get peace. Breathe in, breathe out, follow your breath, ring some tinkling little bells. Oh, this is very peaceful, right? But if you look inside the mind much deeper, what do you see? You start to see these ogres, and this greed, and this hatred, and these unpleasant emotions, and it's very hard to see it in a positive light when you look inside the mind in this way. So it's a very common motif. First entrance into the kingdom very often can be quite pleasant, but still scary. Ever after that, there will be only ogres and demons. So they get fed the food, fine, and they get a nice night's sleep. But once you've started to calm the mind down and turn the mind inwards, start with the meditation, what you start to find is your thinking is running all over the place. And you need to get that anthill and those ants back into an ordered form of thinking. Because your experience is not ordered thinking, your experience is the monkey mind jumping around. For most people, right? Then the next thing you find is you have all these desires, like I want this, and I want that, and I want that. So the next thing you have to do is bring your desires under control. And then finally the thing to do is to get your spiritual aspirations under control. Then finally the princess, who is turned to stone and locked in a chamber inside a castle, inside a magic kingdom that's also turned to stone, at the end of a very long path. This is the final destination. This is the enlightenment that is hidden deep, deep, deep. And so the message is, if you keep going in and keep traveling and keep going deeper and deeper, you're going to see these problems coming up, but eventually you get the beautiful princess. So this story of the Queen Bee is really a story of mindfulness. Mindfulness, as I started out by saying, does not seem like something that is very valuable. It doesn't seem like something that's going to give you spiritual awakening or a great spiritual path. And yet that mindfulness is the key to the problem. Mindfulness, keeping your thoughts tame and in line, keeping your desires in line, and keeping an eye on your spiritual aspirations.